The Japanese thrust into the Aleutians was not an isolated act of aggression but a calculated move in the complex chess game of the Pacific War following the Doolittle raid of April 1942. That audacious American bombing of Tokyo, while militarily insignificant, delivered a profound psychological shock to the Japanese high command, shattering the illusion of the home island's inviolability. In response, the Imperial Japanese Navy, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, developed a sweeping plan to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where it could be annihilated. This grand strategy had two primary prongs: a major thrust against Midway Atoll, the intended knockout blow, and a simultaneous, secondary operation against the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutians component was multifaceted. Its primary objective was strategic misdirection. By attacking the remote American outposts at Dutch Harbor and seizing the westernmost islands, Japan hoped to confuse the U.S. command, split their forces, and draw valuable American carriers north away from the main event at Midway. Beyond this immediate tactical diversion, the operation served longer-term goals. It aimed to secure the northern flank of the Japanese Empire, preventing any future American invasion route from the north via Alaska, a persistent fear within the Japanese command. Furthermore, possession of islands like Attu and Kiska offered a psychological foothold on the North American continent and the potential to interdict Lend-Lease supplies being shipped to the Soviet Union via Alaska. However, from its inception, the Aleutian Campaign was viewed by many of its planners as a secondary theater, a sideshow designed to support a larger victory elsewhere. It was a strategic gamble that would, ironically, escalate into a major commitment for both sides, far beyond its initial intended scope. In the first days of June 1942, as the fleets destined for Midway steamed toward their fateful confrontation, the Northern Area Fleet under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya set its sights on the Aleutians. On June 3, through a break in the notoriously dense fog, Japanese carrier-based aircraft descended upon the U.S. Naval and Army base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. The bombing raids over 2 days were devastating, destroying barracks, a hospital, and fuel tanks, and killing dozens of American servicemen. While the damage was not catastrophic to the overall American war effort, the attack served its purpose as a shocking declaration of intent. The main event, however, was yet to come. With American attention fixed on the smoke rising from Dutch Harbor, Japanese landing forces quietly moved into position. On June 7, as the Battle of Midway reached its devastating conclusion for the Japanese Navy, unopposed landings began on the two most westerly islands, Attu and Kiska. A force of approximately 1,200 Japanese soldiers occupied Attu, quickly subduing its tiny population of an Aleut village and a weather station. On Kiska, a larger garrison of over 5,000 naval troops came ashore, establishing a formidable base complete with anti-aircraft guns, coastal defenses, and a complex of tunnels. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign military power had seized and occupied territory on American soil. The propaganda victory for Japan was immediate, a demonstration of their reach and power that struck at the very heart of American territorial security. The American reaction to the invasion was a volatile mixture of public alarm, strategic confusion, and profound humiliation. Newspapers across the United States blared headlines like "Japs land in Alaska" and "U.S. soil invaded," sparking fear and outrage among a populace that had considered its continent secure. The psychological impact was immense. The war was no longer a distant conflict in the tropics but had literally arrived on America's doorstep. Strategically, the situation was a thorny dilemma for the U.S. High Command. While some military planners, like General Simon Buckner Jr. of the Alaska Defense Command, had long argued for the strategic importance of the region, others viewed the Aleutians as a desolate, worthless theater that would drain resources from the main push in the Central and South Pacific. However, the political and psychological pressure to respond was irresistible. Allowing a foreign army to sit unchallenged on American territory was unthinkable. The islands, however remote, represented a potential dagger pointed at the west coast, a base for further attacks, and a staging ground for possible invasions of the Alaskan mainland. Consequently, what began for the Japanese as a diversionary sideshow now forced the United States into a major commitment. The U.S. was compelled to pour vast resources, soldiers, ships, and aircraft, into this remote and hostile theater, initiating a grueling campaign of aerial bombardment, naval blockade, and eventual amphibious assault to root out the tenacious Japanese garrisons. The Aleutians had become, for America, a thorn in the side, a persistent and nagging wound that demanded a bloody and costly remedy. For the American and Japanese soldiers shipped to the Aleutians, the enemy across the line was often a secondary concern. The true, omnipresent adversary was the environment itself, a primordial force of wind, water, and cold that waged a relentless war of attrition on human body and spirit. The first and most formidable of these elemental foes was the WWII, a sudden, catastrophic wind unique to these latitudes. Without warning, these torrents of cold, dense air would rush down from the glacial mountains with hurricane force, turning serene fjords into maelstrom of white water. Ships at anchor, even substantial naval vessels, could be driven aground or capsized by their fury. The WWII was a constant, terrifying reminder of nature's supremacy, capable of destroying the vital lifeline of supply and support in a matter of minutes. Compounding this was the fog, a pervasive, suffocating shroud that could descend for days, even weeks on end. This was not a gentle mist, but a thick, impenetrable gloom that reduced visibility to mere feet. It rendered air support and reconnaissance flights impossible, grounded vital supply drops, and made naval navigation a deadly gamble through uncharted rocky waters. On the ground, it created a disorienting, claustrophobic world where a man could get lost just yards from his own tent, and the enemy was an invisible phantom, his presence marked only by the muffled sound of a distant shell or the crack of a sniper's rifle from nowhere. This combination of violent wind and blinding fog created a theater of war where the environment dictated every strategy and canceled every plan, holding both armies in a state of suspended, miserable animation. Beyond the atmospheric violence, the very ground beneath their feet was hostile. The landscape was a treeless, exposed expanse of volcanic rock and spongy, waterlogged tundra, offering no natural shelter and little comfort. The infamous Aleutian mud became a character in its own right in the soldiers' stories, a deep, viscous, and seemingly bottomless mire that could swallow boots, immobilize vehicles, and exhaust a man simply trying to walk 100 yards. Trenches, the fundamental refuge of infantrymen across the world, would instantly fill with icy water, becoming cold, open graves rather than protective earthworks. There was no escape from the dampness. Standard issue gear, designed for European winters or the tropics, was utterly useless against the pervasive wet cold. Wool uniforms, once soaked, never truly dried, clinging to skin and sapping body heat relentlessly. The result was a medical crisis defined not by bullet wounds, but by exposure. Trench foot, a debilitating condition where the feet, constantly cold and wet, would swell, numb, and rot, reached epidemic proportions. Frostbite was a constant threat, and respiratory illnesses like pneumonia raced through the cramped, damp quarters of the troops. Perhaps most insidious was the damage to the mind. The endless gray isolation, the absence of sunlight, the constant roar of the wind, and the sheer monotonous misery of existence in such a place led to a condition the soldiers called Aleutianitis, a severe decline in morale characterized by deep depression, apathy, and a profound sense of being forgotten in a worthless corner of the world. The battle for the Aleutians was, therefore, a two-front war. While they prepared to fight a human enemy, the soldiers were locked in a daily, desperate struggle for survival against the elements, a battle many found just as taxing and terrifying as the combat to come. The American operation to recapture Attu, code-named Landgrab, began in May 1943, a full year after the Japanese invasion. The initial landings were a testament not to enemy resistance, but to the island's innate hostility. As American troops waded ashore from their landing craft, they were met not with a hail of bullets, but with the same soul-crushing conditions that had plagued them for months. The frigid, waist-deep water and the boot-sucking mud of the beaches immobilized men and equipment alike. Vehicles bogged down instantly, becoming useless hunks of metal. The cold was so intense that rifles jammed, and machinery refused to function. Yet, a new and bewildering challenge emerged as the troops moved inland. Compasses, the fundamental tool of navigation for any soldier in featureless terrain, spun wildly and became completely unreliable. The men had stumbled upon a terrifying geological phenomenon. Attu was rich in magnetic iron ore, rendering their standard-issue compasses worse than useless. This meant that in the perpetual fog, without recognizable landmarks and without a reliable sense of direction, units became disoriented and lost, often wandering in circles or advancing in the wrong direction entirely. The initial phase of the battle was thus a chaotic struggle against the unseen, where the very ground beneath their feet conspired to betray them, making a coordinated advance against a dug-in enemy nearly impossible. For over 2 weeks, the battle devolved into a brutal, grinding affair of attrition. The American forces, though vastly superior in number and supply, were forced to fight for every inch of the barren, rocky passes against a Japanese force deeply entrenched in the high ground. The defenders, commanded by Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, were heavily outnumbered and critically short of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. They knew reinforcement was impossible. As their perimeter shrank and their situation became hopeless, Yamasaki made a fateful decision. In the early morning fog of May 29th, he launched a desperate all-or-nothing counterattack. This was not a typical military maneuver but a massive, coordinated banzai charge, one of the largest of the entire Pacific War. The remaining Japanese soldiers, many too weak from hunger to run, poured through the American lines in a screaming, chaotic human wave. They overran forward positions, shattered command posts, and in the most harrowing episode of the battle, flooded into a rear-area field hospital. What followed was a scene of primal horror. The fighting descended into a savage, close-quarters melee. Medics and wounded soldiers in the hospital tents fought for their lives with pistols, rifles, and makeshift weapons against Japanese soldiers armed with bayonets, swords, and grenades. The chaos was absolute, a bloody hand-to-hand struggle in the mud and fog that blurred all lines of front and rear, combatant and non-combatant. It was a violent, final convulsion of a doomed army, designed to inflict maximum carnage and to die with honor rather than surrender. When the fury of the final charge subsided and the gunfire faded, the silence that fell over Attu revealed the staggering cost of the victory. The battle had been a near annihilation of the Japanese garrison. Of the roughly 2,900 Japanese soldiers who had defended the island, only 28 remained alive to be taken prisoner. The rest lay dead, with a significant number committing suicide with their final grenades rather than be captured. For the American forces, the price had been shockingly high. In just over 2 weeks of fighting, the U.S. suffered over 3,800 casualties. This included nearly 1,200 soldiers killed in action, a casualty rate of over 20%, one of the highest of any American amphibious operation in the Pacific theater. When viewed against the size of the opposing force, the numbers were even more stark. For every Japanese defender on the island, an American soldier became a casualty. The victory was Pyrrhic, a sobering and bloody awakening for the U.S. military. It demonstrated that even a small, isolated, and outnumbered Japanese force, when dug into a defensible position, could demand a terrible blood price. The American cemetery on Attu, a lonely field of white crosses in the vast empty landscape, stood as a silent, grim testament to the fact that this forgotten island, this prize no one wanted, had exacted a sacrifice as profound as any more famous battlefield. Emboldened by the costly victory on Attu, Allied command turned its attention to the last Japanese stronghold on American soil, the island of Kiska. Here, intelligence suggested, a garrison of over 5,000 seasoned troops lay in wait, dug into a labyrinth of tunnels and fortified positions that made the defenses on Attu seem rudimentary. Expecting a fight that would dwarf the bloodshed of the previous battle, the Allies assembled a massive invasion force. Over 34,000 American and Canadian soldiers, a force 7 times the size of the one that had landed on Attu, were mobilized for what was ominously code-named Operation Cottage. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and protracted battles of the Pacific Campaign. On August 15, 1943, under the customary cover of a thick Aleutian fog, the first waves of troops stormed the beaches, their nerves steeled for the onslaught of enemy fire. Yet, as they advanced inland, an eerie silence prevailed. No machine guns chattered from the hills. No mortars rained down on the landing zones. The only resistance they encountered was the same oppressive fog and the sucking, familiar mud. Patrols pushed cautiously forward, discovering empty gun emplacements, deserted living quarters, and warehouses filled with abandoned supplies. The stunning, almost unbelievable truth slowly dawned on the Allied command. The entire Japanese garrison had vanished. In a breathtaking feat of audacity and seamanship, the Japanese Imperial Navy had, 3 weeks prior, exploited a thick fog bank to slip an entire evacuation fleet right under the noses of the American naval blockade. In just 55 minutes, they had successfully extracted every one of their 5,183 soldiers from the island without a single casualty. The Allies had thrown their might at a ghost. However, the island of Kiska had one final, cruel deception to play. The initial relief of finding the island empty quickly curdled into tension and paranoia as the dense, unyielding fog refused to lift. In this opaque world, every sound was a potential threat, every shadow a hidden enemy. The massive invasion force, primed for a vicious fight, now turned in on itself in a tragic series of misunderstandings. Isolated patrols, moving through the murk, heard movement and assumed it was the enemy they had come to fight. In the ensuing confusion, American and Canadian units mistook each other for Japanese forces, triggering frantic and deadly firefights. The chaos was not confined to the land. In the treacherous waters offshore, where visibility was near zero, landing craft and naval vessels blundered into minefields laid by the Americans themselves months earlier to trap the Japanese fleet. The explosions that tore through hulls were from their own weapons. For 2 days, this tragic farce continued, a nightmare of miscommunication and fear where the only enemy was the fog and their own preparedness. When the operation was finally declared over and the island secured, the cost was tallied. There were no Japanese casualties. Instead, the Allied force suffered over 313 casualties. Nearly 100 men were dead or missing, and scores more were wounded, every single one a victim of friendly fire, naval mines, or booby traps left behind by the vanished garrison. The battle for Kiska was over, and it stood as a profoundly absurd and somber coda to the Aleutian Campaign, a victory where the greatest losses were inflicted not by the enemy, but by the environment and the very fear of the enemy that had already gone.